Scene 1, Apple, take 1.
MCAD deficiency is caused by a lack of medium-chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase, which is involved in the metabolism of medium-chain fatty acids. There are actually a number of different acyl-CoA dehydrogenase enzymes, each of which metabolize fatty acids of different length. Put another way, different enzymes metabolize long-chain, medium-chain, and short-chain fatty acids. MCAD deficiency is the most common of the acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiencies, so we'll use it as our prototype when thinking about these diseases. In reality though, deficiencies in any of the acyl-CoA dehydrogenase enzymes present very similarly, so you can lump them together in your head on test day. Before we get started, make sure you review our scene on fatty acid breakdown in the carnitine shuttle, as this video builds on that one. To anchor our scene on MCAD, we turn to the set of a MCAD. Wait, what's a MCAD? It's an advertisement for the popular restaurant chain that sells fast food burgers. I'm sure you've seen one before. What you probably didn't know though is that our scene on carnitine deficiency is actually a look inside the McFactory. The meat from that image, the carnitine, is actually what they put inside the burgers. Anyway, this scene takes place on the set of a MCAD, so viewers can get a look inside the factory. That way, they can be assured that what they're eating is quality. Before we jump in, I want to briefly review the carnitine shuttle and beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is the process that breaks down fats and generates energy from them. The enzymes for beta oxidation are in the mitochondrial matrix, so the first step in fatty acid breakdown is to get fatty acids into the matrix. That's where the carnitine shuttle comes in. The carnitine shuttle is used to transport fatty acids into the matrix, after which they can undergo beta oxidation. Let's go through this more explicitly. First, fatty acids combine with coenzyme A to form fatty acyl-CoA. The fatty acid is then transferred to carnitine, forming fatty acyl-carnitine. After it's attached to carnitine, it can then pass through the inner mitochondrial membrane into the mitochondrial matrix. Once in the matrix, the fatty acid is transferred back to CoA. The resulting fatty acyl-CoA can then undergo beta oxidation, which generates energy. With that out of the way, let's get back to the story. For this commercial, the director brought in a top-notch Hollywood actor to play the role of the beta oxidation ox hydra. But, I don't think he's feeling so well. We'll get to why in a minute, but for now, just know that he's not really doing his job. Recall from biochemistry that acyl-CoA dehydrogenase is the first step in the beta oxidation of fatty acids. Also recall from our carnitine scene that we use sour cream, an easel, and a croquet stick to represent fatty acyl-CoA. Sour cream represents the fatty acid, the easel represents the acyl, and croquet represents CoA. Putting this together, we get fatty easel croquet, or fatty acyl-CoA. Next, the hydra that is about to eat the fatty easel croquet must therefore be fatty acyl-CoA dehydrogenase, hydra for dehydrogenase. And more specifically, it's an ox hydra because this represents the first step of beta oxidation. So, in MCAD deficiency, the ox hydra that breaks down medium-chain fatty acids is impaired, which explains why our ox hydra movie star here isn't doing his job. When beta oxidation breaks down, everything upstream of it accumulates. Take a look at the other actor who is playing the guy about to get eaten. Just do your job, man, I want to go home. Also notice how a bunch of the carnitine meat is piling up behind him. These symbols should remind you of fatty acyl-carnitines, which accumulate with acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency. This is important because it's going to give us a way to differentiate between systemic primary carnitine deficiency. Both systemic primary carnitine deficiency and MCAD present pretty much identically, but in systemic primary carnitine deficiency, there is no carnitine. So you won't see any fatty acyl-carnitines. So, in short, the accumulation of fatty acyl-carnitines will give you a way to differentiate between these two diseases. Now let's figure out why our movie star of a hydra is so out of it today. As with many Hollywood superstars, he has a bit of a substance abuse problem. See all those broken ketone cans? And what's all that powdery stuff? We'll call it, sugar. Ketone is our symbol for ketones, and sugar is our symbol for glucose. Taken together, these two symbols should remind you of the hypoketotic hypoglycemia seen in the disease. This is really high yield, and it's almost certainly how you'll get tested on exam day. Between periods of eating, the body relies on stored energy in order to keep the body running. Initially, the body breaks down glycogen from the liver, which then distributes glucose to the rest of the body. Liver glycogen stores only last for a short period of time though, typically for around 24 hours. During prolonged periods of fasting, the body needs to break down fat for energy. The fat can then be broken down into acetyl-CoA via beta oxidation, after which the acetyl-CoA can be converted into ketone bodies for distribution to the rest of the body, or it can go straight into the Krebs cycle. In patients with MCAD, however, prolonged periods of fasting are especially dangerous. When these patients need to switch from glycogen stores to fat stores, things go awry. They can't break down fat, so they are unable to generate the ketone bodies they need. This is what is meant by hypoketotic hypoglycemia. They are hypoglycemic because they have run out of liver glycogen, and they are hypoketotic because they can't form ketone bodies to compensate. While we're here, I also want to mention the treatment for MCAD. As you probably guessed, the treatment is to avoid the breakdown of fatty acids. These patients have normal glycogen storage and breakdown, so they really only get problems when they need to rely on fatty acid breakdown. So long story short, just make sure you don't fast for more than 24 hours. Now let's talk about some of the signs and symptoms seen in MCAD deficiency. Take a look at our ox hydra. Each one of his heads represents a different manifestation of the disease. First, notice how the first head looks really out of it. This should remind you of lethargy and coma. This makes perfect sense since patients typically present with hypoglycemia. Next, the middle head is vomiting, which should remind you of, well, vomiting. Finally, the last head is knocked out, which should remind you of the death that can occur secondary to hypoglycemia. In fact, this very same hypoglycemia can lead to sudden death in infants and children affected with the disease. Now, with those out of the way, I also want to mention that you shouldn't spend much time memorizing these specific signs and symptoms, because, well, they're obvious. Just know that the patient is hypoglycemic and you should be good to go. Next, take a look at the director who is angrily shaking his hand at the ox hydra. This shaking hand should remind you of the seizures that are commonly seen at presentation. Again, this is also obvious since hypoglycemia can present with seizures. Seriously, I encourage you not to memorize this here. Next, take a look at the director's chair for something you should actually memorize. Notice how it's kind of liver-shaped? This should remind you of the liver dysfunction and hepatomegaly that can be seen in MCAD. This sort of makes sense, since the carnitine shuttle and beta oxidation take place in the liver. The accumulation of fatty acids and fatty acyl carnitines can then lead to liver damage, thereby explaining this finding. Next, take a look at the box of ammo on top of the director's camera. Is that ammo, or is that film? Because film is really the ammo for the camera, right? Anyway, the elevated ammo here should remind you of hyperammonemia, which can be seen in the disease. Again, this sort of makes sense. The best reasoning I can give you is that since the body can't break down fats, it relies more heavily on amino acid breakdown, which in turn leads to hyperammonemia. That being said, the mechanism here really isn't that well understood, but hey, that's what visual mnemonics are here for. Alright, so that's all for MCAD deficiency. Let's recap. MCAD deficiency is caused by a lack of medium-chain acyl-CoA dehydrogenase, which is involved in the metabolism of medium-chain fatty acids. It is one of the acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiencies, and there are different acyl-CoA dehydrogenase enzymes for fatty acids of different lengths. Each of these deficiencies present similarly though, so you should think of them as just one disease for your exam. When fatty acids undergo beta oxidation, they must first be transported into the mitochondrial matrix via the carnitine shuttle. Acyl-CoA dehydrogenase represents the first step in beta oxidation, so a breakdown here leads to an accumulation of the intermediates upstream, notably fatty acyl carnitines. When beta oxidation is impaired, patients cannot rely on fats for energy. This is particularly salient during periods of prolonged fasting, during which the body needs to produce ketone bodies. Patients who undergo prolonged fasting develop hypoketotic hypoglycemia, which is again a consequence of being unable to metabolize fats. During these periods, patients may present with lethargy, vomiting, seizures, coma, and even death. Patients may also develop liver dysfunction / hepatomegaly, and hyperammonemia may be seen. Phew, alright, that's it. MCAD deficiency is actually a great question to test you on because answering it requires you to integrate a lot of different concepts. Make sure you have a solid understanding of what happens under normal conditions, and you should have no problems answering questions on this disease. We'll see you next time.